Pleased to have with me once again Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome back, Daniel.
Thanks so much, Jay. It's great to be with you again.
Always good to have you. We missed you last week, but I guess you were in transit from a visit to your boss, Ron Paul.
Yes.
How is the congressman doing?
Oh, he's doing great. He's keeping very busy down there, and it was nice to be down in Texas where there actually is a springtime.
Yeah. Well, we're finally getting one up here in the Northeast as well. But I have to ask you, I understand that you've just passed through the first year at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Is that right?
Thanks, Jay. That's absolutely correct. I can't believe it was just April of last year that we opened our doors, and we were all very nervous. We didn't know what kind of reception we'd get, and I have to say we've been thrilled by how many people have come to join us, to support us, thankfully, and to read what we do. I just looked on our Facebook page this morning, and we just hit a new record. Almost 400,000 people saw our posts over the past week. So
wonderful. That's really good.
It's very humbling,
Yeah.
Just appreciate every single person who looks at what we do.
Well, there's a lot to look at there, I might add. And as I looked at your site this morning, one of the things that really grabbed me, and I really have to ask you about this, Daniel, is a lead article that Ron Paul has written, Armed Federal Agents, and this has to do with the Bundy Ranch and the confiscation of property that is owned, private property that is owned by the Bundys. And the reason I think this is so apropos to talk about today, I want to ask you to summarize Ron's remarks on this, but the reason is because we just heard in the first hour of today's show, we heard from James Rickards about the currency wars, and that ties in with what the second interview, or the other second interview that we had today. Greg Hunter interviewed Fabian Calvo, who is convinced that this confiscation is a bigger picture, and he believes that in fact the property is being confiscated and handed over to the Chinese as a way to try to keep the Chinese satisfied and not dumping dollars, which gets back to the whole Rickards fear that and concern that the dollar's days are numbered. Well, I don't know about whether that is true or not, whether Mr. Calvo has that correct or not. He seems to have some evidence pointing in that direction. But maybe you could just tell our listeners a little bit about Ron's article and a little bit about this Bundy situation.
Sure. Well, one of the things that Dr. Paul talks about in his weekly column this week is that a lot of this problem is simply because of the what we call the tragedy of the commons. That when property is owned by, quote, everyone, or, quote, the people, and in effect, it's owned by no one.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, because there is no ownership, there's no long-term incentive for individuals to improve the property and that sort of thing. And you're also subject to the capriciousness of the government, which really does control it. It's not controlled by the people. So in the case with the Bundys, they moved in the 19th century to Nevada, where lots of people were promised that they could graze cattle on federal land in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, the government decided, for whatever reason, they claimed there were tortoises or this or that and the other, to change the terms of the deal. And it's a very unfortunate situation. Dr. Paul writes that thankfully, at least in the short term, it was resolved without violence. But as to Dr. Paul's style, he doesn't mention names in his column. But as we all know, Senator Harry Reid called the supporters of the Bundys domestic terrorists last week.
Right. I see, in fact, there's another article on the Ron Paul Institute that talks exactly about that by Adam Dick.
Exactly.
And, and the heading is Senator Reid ups threats against Bundy Ranch protesters, calling them domestic terrorists. Well, isn't that nice? Anybody that disagrees with the ruling elite is now becoming a terrorist.
Yeah, and I think it's not just an expletive, or it's not just a term of demeanment of these protests. I think he's trying to be clever and provide some legal justification for the future use of force against these people. After all, the Patriot Act, which was passed right after 9/11 over the objection of a few members of Congress, Dr. Paul included, foresaw this exact possibility. And the people who were opposed to it warned that this would be used against Americans. And so if Reid and others can establish the fact that these people are domestic terrorists, then, of course, the use of force, who knows, even military force against them, would be justified.
Yeah.
So really you're entering into an unknown realm. Maybe it was a slip of the tongue. I tend to think it was not.
No, I doubt.
Jay, sure, yeah. Jay, I mean, the problem is the government has unlimited resources. It
right.
doesn't have to, unlike the rest of us, it doesn't have to show a balance sheet at the end of the day, at the end of the quarter.
No.
So
And let me just say that one of the reasons they have unlimited resources is that they have unlimited money printing capability, which gets back to a lot of other issues. I'm sorry.
no, absolutely, you're right. I'm sorry to go on, but the thing is, they can have a tactical retreat, as I think we've seen over the past week.
Yeah.
Where they pull back because everyone's attention is on this.
Right.
And then they can wait for these people to go home because normal people like you and I and everyone else have jobs. Exactly. So they can wait for everyone to go home and then quietly go back in and do what they attempted to do in the first place. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but unfortunately there's nothing to stop them. And that's really the root of the problem, a government that's just become authoritarian and it just refuses to back down over anything.
Yeah. Well, Reed is saying that we're not finished, we're coming back.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that it's my understanding that I believe it's on that Bundy property actually that the Reeds have some of their own corporate interest or some business interest there with a solar. Perhaps they're making it available for a solar plant or something that the Chinese are going to own.
Yes, I've read something about it. I read that Terry Reed's son is involved in that deal. So.
Right. So this is crony capitalism, but it crosses borders now, and again it gets back to the allegations, whether it's true or not. Calvo's allegations and belief that this is a much bigger picture than just the Bundy Ranch. That there, in fact, vast tracts of land now that the government is maybe prepared to make available in one way or another. To the Chinese to placate them against dumping dollars. If that's true, I don't know, but it makes sense to me. It really does make sense. You mentioned the tortoises, Daniel, and it sort of sent shivers up my back because as one who follows the mining industry, we all know how the BLM, uses tortoises or some sort of insect or something that might be an endangered species, or they put them on the list of endangered species and then use that as a means to make mining companies spend millions and millions of dollars to try to prove that they're not going to kill the poor tortoises or the insects as a way to control against the individual private interests. But in any event, this is something I think we want to watch very carefully. It's very, very important. I don't know what we can do except to let people know about it, and hopefully people will understand that it's not just someone else's problem. It's not just the Bundy's problem. It's all of our problems, because if the government can take our private property, they can take our very lives, and that's what I think is at stake. Well, speaking of taking lives, this morning I was looking at watching Bloomberg, as I often do when I wake up here in New York City, and there was a Republican. I have to think he's a neocon. I don't remember his name offhand, but he did run for Congress, I think, from Nevada, and he was really saying why we need to go to war against Russia in the Ukraine. He was really very bellicose and belligerent about the whole thing, and it clearly there is a part of the Republican Party that is, I think, going to try to stand up and blame Obama for not being more militant against Putin. Do you think that's the strategy, to try to appeal to the public and regain the White House on those grounds?
Well, they always do that. They try to first of all, they try to use propaganda to establish the absolute reduction to the most simplistic terms. I was having breakfast with my family yesterday morning, and I happened to look up. There's the TV in this restaurant, and I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the subtitle was Obama versus Putin.
Right.
And I remarked how unbelievable it is. It's such a complex issue, a complex geopolitical issue, a complex social issue, cultural issue, is reduced in the U.S. media to something like a prize fight.
Right.
A Holyfield versus Tyson or something. And it just shows what happens when you establish these two guys clashing. And then you can have, as you say, the neocons coming out and suggesting that he's a wimp for not going in and this sort of thing. And I think it creates a very dangerous situation, because you also have the administration being very injudicious with its use of threats and warnings. There will be consequences if you don't do this, and then they don't do it, and there are no real consequences.
Right.
So on both sides, you have sort of a race for higher rhetoric that is, I think, very dangerous.
Indeed, very dangerous for sure. But let me just ask you, what's the latest, if you could update our listeners on the Ukraine now? I understand, I believe Vice President is heading over there now, or is in the Ukraine now, meeting with our hand-picked dictator.
I'm sure that will solve the problems.
Yeah.
Well, the Secretary of State John Kerry announced in Geneva toward the end of last week that there had been an agreement reached between the U.S., Russia, EU, and Ukraine to de-escalate, to move forward, and what have you. However, if you listen to the press conference that he delivered after this was announced, and if you look at the text of the agreement, there's really no there there. It doesn't make any sense. The only thing they said is that all illegal armed groups must disarm immediately, and that the OSCE would come in and monitor the situation. And of course, as you say, the U.S. handpicked government in there has simply turned their thugs, the right sector, and these sort of very unpleasant fellows, they've turned them into a national militia, which is unconstitutional according to the Ukrainian constitution. But by that saying that they're not illegal, so now they're saying that only one side needs to disarm, and so it really is a mess. But meanwhile, while nobody's looking, here comes NATO ratcheting up the issue like you wouldn't believe. Even as things were somewhat settling down before this Geneva conference, nobody really noticed, but the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, General Phil Breedlove, said in a press conference last week, essentially invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is the war clause. And he said, and interestingly enough, he said it based on complete lie. I mean, just simply inaccurate. He said that Russia came across the border, an international border. It imposed its will on a sovereign state and annexed part of that nation. So because of that, we need to take measures to assure our allies of our commitment to our Article 5 collective defense. So essentially he's ratcheting it up. He's going over the head of his commander-in-chief, President Obama, saying that Article 5 is invoked. And it's not true that what happened in Crimea was Russia coming across a border, because they were already there.
And they had a right to be there. They had an agreement.
They had an agreement. They had a right to be there. It imposed its will on a sovereign nation. There was a referendum, and as Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said last week, you simply can't put a gun to the head of 87% of the population and force them to go vote.
Yeah.
You can't do it. And it's not defending the Russians to simply point out what the Americans say is wrong.
Right.
But what Breedlove says is just factually incorrect.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, actually, it's interesting that in Kerry's press conference last week, he did not mention Crimea. And he was actually asked a question afterward saying, have you all given up on Crimea? And, of course, he got very indignant and this and that. But I think the U.S. realizes that this is simply a non-starter. And they've tried to drop it as quietly as possible. But then you have NATO ratcheting it up, not only Breedlove, but the NATO allied, the Secretary General of NATO, Rasmussen from Denmark. You may have heard last week, he said, NATO will have more ships in the water, more planes in the air, and more readiness on the ground. As they announced they're going to send some 10,000 troops into Poland.
Right. Exactly. Well, it clearly somebody wants war, and the fact that somebody has gone over the head of Obama suggests to me that Obama may not be the guy in charge, that there are other forces much bigger than the president that are in play here. Would you think that? Am I off on that? Well,
look what happened to was it MacArthur, excuse me, in the Korean conflict when he started doing something like this.
Right.
Obama needs to rein in his military if they're going to start speaking out of turn like this.
Yeah. Or else, former President Jimmy Carter is right when he says that we do not currently have a working democracy. And I think there was actually, interesting, I haven't seen it yet, but a study that came out of Princeton, of all places, that came to the same conclusion this last week that was published. I want to take a look at that. But if the elected head of our country, and as powerful as he is, we've given all kinds of power. We've taken it away from the Congress and away from even the judiciary, and have given it to the executive. If he doesn't have the power or the will to rein in the military, then God help us.
And the crazy thing about what's happening in Ukraine is, from everything that I've seen, you have a few things that I think are very important to remember. I don't think Russia wants Ukraine. The U.S. is behaving as if Russia wants to invade Ukraine and on to the Baltics and to reconstitute the Soviet Union. There's just simply no evidence for that. I think, first of all, who would want Eastern Ukraine? Who would want Ukraine? It's a basket case. Who wants to dump money into it? Who wants to be economically responsible? It's already broken. Nobody wants to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
And what the Russians have said, and I think it makes perfect sense. They would like to see, not that anyone should impose their will on a foreign country, but they'd like to see an increased federalism in Ukraine, where the different regions would have more autonomy. And I think to at least to me, and I know probably to you, Jay, any kind of subsidiarity is good. Anytime you can devolve power down to local levels,
Absolutely,
it's a positive. So and so that also takes care of some of the problems they have with differences between East and West.
yeah.
And Russia does not want Ukraine to be in NATO. They don't want to see NATO bases in Ukraine on Russia's doorstep.
Sure, yeah.
So,
any more than we would like to see Russian or Chinese forces in Mexico.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think these things would resolve themselves if the U.S. would stop ratcheting it up. If people like General Breedlove would stop, shooting his mouth off. And
Well, Daniel, let me ask you this, because it seems to me that the biggest problem, the disconnect here from Americans, is that they don't understand that we have these NGOs and these private interests that are really itching for more war. I believe it's because they think they can make a quick buck. I honestly believe that Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex is really what we're seeing play out here, in part. I don't know if you agree with that, but
sure. I mean, NATO has no purpose. It was an alliance that was set up to oppose the Warsaw Pact, which doesn't exist.
right.
And you can literally see the glee on the faces of these NATO officials now that they feel they have some sort of purpose.
Yeah.
But what a smaller purpose it is now. It used to be, and we actually feature something by one of our board members, Mark Ullman, professor at Oxford. And NATO used to be a device whereby former opponents and belligerents could get together and find common cause.
Mm-hmm.
After World War II, France and Germany, the U.S. and Germany. And now it's being used by small minor states to essentially punch above their weight class.
Mm-hmm.
The Poland wants to lasso the to lasso the U.S. in to fight its long-standing battles with Russia and its hatred to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, is an old-time neocon. He used to work for the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
So you have NATO being used by these tiny countries with no regard to the real implications, because they have a long-standing beef with Russia going back to the Soviet Union, which doesn't even exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's perverse, no question about it. But it just seems to me, Daniel, one of the biggest problems in the propaganda wars that are being fought is that Putin is made into being a bad guy who has all these uncontrollable people running around trying to destabilize the government. And of course, we would never do that. America would never support any kind of NGOs or anybody else that would destabilize, even though history is clear, I think, very clear. I mean, starting out in Iran and Chile and other places over the years, I think probably the color revolution that took place a couple of years back in North Africa, that we are constantly involved in destabilizing even elected governments. But the American people don't get that story, do they?
No, and it's an issue of cause and effect. I mean, I have no particular affection for Putin, despite what some might say. He's a politician. Of course, he's a bad guy, as Lew Rockwell would say. However, any person with a brain has to look at cause and effect. The U.S. admittedly was involved in overthrowing the government in Kiev. Ukraine is a very delicately balanced country, maybe even an unworkable country the way it's currently put together.
Yeah.
So when the U.S. comes in and just basically throws a fastball at that house of cards, there will be a reaction. There is blowback to foreign policy actions.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing in the East is Russian blowback. It may well be true, as the U.S. says, that the eastern Ukraine is swarming with intelligence agents from Russia,
mm-hmm.
or soldiers from Russia. We've yet to see, a handful of them even captured and unmasked.
Yeah.
So we need to see some evidence. But we do know for a fact that the U.S. head of intelligence was in Kiev last week, advising the government in Ukraine. So why is it so horrible of the claims that Russia is involved in the East with this intelligence, but no one says a word about the head of U.S. intelligence going in and advising the government, and the next day you had the beginning of this what's become a farcical crackdown in the East. So
Yeah.
it's, once again, it's okay if we do it, but nobody else better do anything like it.
Yeah, hypocritical. Of course, the propaganda here is that we have it all right. We are the American exceptionalism. Well, what I would say to that, and I have no love for Putin either, but let me say this, with a 13% flat tax compared to what we have in America, and now with our agents going out and at the point of force and violence taking private property from Americans, I'm not so sure. 13% tax is still confiscation. That's what Putin's doing to his people, but it's a flat tax, and it is a darn sight lower than what we are paying in America. And I don't see the difference, honestly. I have a lot of trouble now in seeing the direction of our country, Daniel, the way it's going. It's hard to, that doesn't make Putin a good guy, but all I'm saying is look at the evidence.
Portion.
Yeah.
The thing is, even if it's as worse as the strongest war hawk neocon says, even if it's as bad as that in Ukraine,
right?
What on earth, as you point out, we've got federal agents confiscating property on a daily basis, restricting our liberties, feeling us up at airports.
Yep.
What on earth businesses of ours, even if it is as bad as they say, which I don't believe it is, but even if it was, what does it matter? Do they really want to resurrect this old argument that we're going to all be speaking Russian tomorrow if we don't stop them in some godforsaken, poverty-stricken country in Ukraine? It's just absurd.
Yeah, it is absurd, Daniel, but I guess the world is absurd, and from the beginning of time we've had issues like this, similar issues, and unfortunately I think for the longest time in this country, with the Constitution we had, to the extent we followed it, we don't anymore, that we did have some exceptionalism to be proud of in America, but it doesn't seem to me it's going in the right direction. But I know that you at the Ron Paul Institute are doing what you can to try to turn things around. I want to thank you very much for being with us once again, Daniel. We'll look to talk to you again next week and get an update
so much, Jay.
as on the Ukraine or anything else that pops up in the meantime. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jay.